The last time I was in London, I asked my cab driver about his training and what kind of test he needed to pass in order to get licensed. It turned out he needed to know 25,000 streets and 20,000 landmarks. It took him 3 years to learn how to become a cab driver. This stood in marked contrast to my own training as a New York City cab driver. I was asked to know 10 landmarks. I was told them all in advance. 2 were the same. They were Madison Square Garden and Penn Station. For Yankee Stadium, I had to be able to say the Bronx, and for Shea Stadium, I had to be able to say Queens. And I only had to get 60% right, and I was able to take the test 3 times in 1 day. The reason I was so curious about my cabbie's training wasn't just to compare it to my own experience, though. I was interested to hear firsthand because studies of London cabbie brains are often cited as evidence for experience-dependent neuroplasticity, the fact that different parts of our brains grow or shrink based on how we use them. In the course of their training, compared with controls, London cabbies developed extra-large posterior hippocampi, parts of the brain that are associated with memory. And it's this sort of study that's prompted researchers to see how mindfulness practice might affect brain structure and function. But let's back up a bit. What exactly do we mean by brain structure and function? And how do these relate to the idea of the mind, which we've been talking about throughout the course? Different philosophical schools and approaches posit different relationships between the constructs of mind and brain. The way I'm using the terms, I mean mind to signify the information being processed and our subjective experience and consciousness moment to moment. Brain, on the other hand, involves what's going on in the underlying tissue structures. And what we're discovering is that the mind changes the brain and the brain changes the mind. Now, why do you think studying neurobiology or the brain might matter? Well, there's a number of reasons. Neurobiological studies are often what draw people to mindfulness practice these days. They think, oh, I'll be able to improve this or that aspect of my brain function or my brain structure. And they wind up, however, with a path to rather profound changes, even paths to psychological and emotional liberation. There's a Zen koan about this. Students are sent off to meditate on this and try to figure out what it means. Intending to buy iron, they obtain gold. And one interpretation is people are drawn to these practices to try to fix something in their life. But what they wind up with is a rather profound personal and interpersonal transformation. Also, by studying mindfulness and the effects of mindfulness on neurobiology, we get to see our mind as an impersonal process. We get to see that the thoughts and feelings that arise are actually just neurobiology unfolding. Increasingly, neurobiology also gives us the idea of possible new interventions. For example, neurofeedback. There are some studies being done in which they connect a computer to an imaging machine so that a subject can get real-time feedback on what their brain is doing in each moment. And as a result, they're better able to train their brain in certain ways. Now, scientists face many challenges in studying the neurobiology of mindfulness practices. And by reviewing them, we can understand that neurobiology better. The first question is, what do we want to look at? Are we interested in the momentary effects of mindfulness practice? In other words, what's happening in the brain while we're actually meditating, versus the enduring effects? What happens to our brain over time if we take up meditation practices? In psychological research, these are called state effects, the momentary ones, and trait effects, the more long-lasting ones. Now, state effects and trait effects reinforce one another. Let's say we take up a behavior like mindfulness practice. Well, that's going to change the activity of the brain, and those changes in brain activity are actually going to change the structure of the brain. Then this changed structure of the brain is going to, in turn, change the activity of the brain, and this newly revised activity of the brain is going to influence our behavior. So these things are reinforcing one another regularly. So what are some of the challenges in studying state effects? Well, there's the question of what's the meditator actually doing as we're observing them? Is he or she concentrating on the breath? Or perhaps enjoying a pleasant fantasy? or maybe even remembering to run an errand. Where exactly is the boundary between meditation and non-meditation? If you ask a question of a person while they're in a scanner, simply hearing and answering the question changes brain activity. So maybe what we're measuring in terms of the moment-to-moment activity is simply the person's response to the question. These are difficult challenges. When we study trait effects, the enduring changes, there are challenges there too. Because the way we study those is by looking at people who've been doing meditation over time and comparing them to people who haven't been doing meditation over time. But perhaps only certain people choose to meditate. Maybe the effects that we observe are because they're disproportionately vegetarian or disproportionately highly educated. Or maybe it's because they've adopted a belief system. And it's, of course, well nigh impossible to get random samples here. You can't very easily take a pair of identical twins, for example, and get one to meditate for 10 years and the other not to, or for that matter, to randomly distribute people to 10 years of meditation practice or 10 years of a control group and study their brains afterwards. So these are tough challenges from a scientific standpoint. There's the challenge that faces both state and trait studies, both the momentary studies and the over lifetime effect studies. We don't know if people can accurately report on their degree of mindfulness. You may recall the Dunning-Kruger effect, where we discussed the way people who actually have less mindfulness practice experience tend to rate their level of mindfulness higher than people with more experience. And this is because a person needs some degree of mindfulness to be able to notice if he or she is being mindful, to notice what the mind is doing in each moment. But if we didn't do self-report, what would the objective referent be? Currently, we're pretty much stuck with self-report. There are 9 scales that are in use, and all of them ask people about their personal experiences and what they observe in their own minds. To complicate matters further, it turns out that they found 5 factors, 5 elements in mindfulness practice, but these appear to be different depending on the experience level. So some factors seem to develop more at lower levels of experience, and other factors seem to develop more at higher levels of experience. If we weren't to use self-report scales, what might we use as a measure? Should we use the hours or years in meditation practice? It's a possibility, but we don't know exactly what the intensity of the meditation practice was or how well trained the person was. Also, until recently, we really didn't have good active controls. So what we would do is we would assign people to meditation practice, or we might assign them to a waiting list. But we couldn't tell if the effects that we were measuring were actually the effects of doing the meditation or simply getting attention for being in the study, or participating in part of a group, or maybe being exposed to a new belief system. And our sophisticated high-tech equipment can't solve these kinds of problems. Despite these challenges, we are learning something about the neurobiological changes. And we do this in part because we have several interesting methods for being able to study what's going on in the brain. One set of methods measures electrical activity, and our chief instrument here is the electroencephalogram, or an EEG. And this is very sensitive to moment-to-moment changes. The way we set up an EEG is we put hundreds now, to do the high-resolution kind, of electrodes all over the skull. And these electrodes can pick up very subtle movements in electrical activity. The problem with this is that the image we get is a bit blurry, because all of the electrical signals have to pass through the skull and pass through the skin. So it's very hard to tell exactly where in the brain activity is taking place. On the other hand, the EEG is very sensitive to changes over time. We can see in micro detail what's happening from moment to moment. The other way we can look at what's happening in the brain is through neuroimaging. And there are essentially 3 types. First, there's PET scanning. That's positron emission tomography. And it was used more in the early days. It detects radiation from emission of positrons. And the reason it's not used so often anymore in meditation studies is that these positrons decay, and you can only actually record what they're doing during the period of time that they're decaying. So you can only get very short videos of what's going on in the brain. Also, subjects aren't so keen about having radiation injected into them, so this has fallen a little bit into disuse. Much more frequently used these days is magnetic resonance imaging, or MRIs. What happens in an MRI is we're detecting a radio frequency signal that's emitted by excited hydrogen atoms in the body. And these are present in any tissue containing water molecules, including, of course, the brain. And using energy from an oscillating magnetic field that's applied at the appropriate resonant frequency, we're able to determine what's happening with those hydrogen atoms. This provides excellent imaging for soft tissue, including the brain. The resolution is quite clear, but an MRI only takes a snapshot, so we only see what's happening at this particular moment in time. The other instrument we have is called an fMRI, or a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine. And this is like a video of an MRI. It takes a series of MRI pictures, one right after the other. The video is somewhat jerky because there are slow refresh rates for the frames, and the resolution isn't quite as good as an MRI, but you can see what's happening in the brain in real time. And unlike PET scanning, which you could only do a PET scan over a brief period of time, you can do a functional MRI over 40 minutes or so. So we can get a long video about what's happening in the course of meditation practice. So what have we learned? Well, we've learned a lot about changes in brain function. The first area that we've noticed changes in is attention. And this shouldn't be a surprise since, obviously, when we do meditation practice, the first thing we're doing is training the brain and training the mind to pay attention in a different way. Now, attention has different components to it. It includes alerting, and that's becoming aware of a stimulus like a horn honking or a baby screaming. And it also includes sustained attention, which is following a stimulus over time. Very closely related to sustained attention is the idea of conflict monitoring, which is about remaining focused despite distractions that are trying to pull our attention away. We found that mindfulness practice improves both alerting and sustained attention. In fact, as little as 8 weeks of training improved the detection of unexpected stimuli that were introduced in the laboratory. And it improved the ability to maintain attention on a stimulus over time. A study of 3-month retreat participants, so these are folks who spent the last 3 months doing sitting meditation, walking meditation, eating meditation, developing a lot of concentration. For those folks, they found reduced attentional blink. An attentional blink is the difficulty identifying a second stimulus when two are presented in rapid succession. If our minds aren't trained in mindfulness practice, we tend to miss the second one. But it turned out that the retreat participants tended to catch it. A related study studied 4 Zen masters, people who had been at this for many, many years. And they showed that they had reduced habituation to stimuli. They hooked them up with an EEG, and they exposed them to clicking sounds. And people who aren't trained in meditation practice, after the first few clicks, they start to zone out. They start not to notice the subsequent ones. For the Zen masters, each click was vibrant, had the same effect on the EEG over time. It's an interesting study in that it demonstrates that the Zen masters were developing what we're calling beginner's mind, this capacity to see each new event, each new experience, as though it's fresh and new, rather than habituating to it. Now, mindfulness meditation practice also seems to stave off all sorts of normal cognitive declines that are associated with aging. Older meditators have been shown to outperform age-matched participants, so other people of their same age, but who haven't been meditating, on an attentional blink task, on tasks assessing attention, short-term memory, perceptual speed, how quickly they can recognize things, and executive functioning. Executive functioning has to do with decision-making as to what's most relevant in a circumstance to pay attention to. The investigators also reported that the typical negative correlation between age and sustained attention, as we get older, it's harder to follow a stimulus over time, wasn't present in Zen meditators. A recent study addressed something a bit more sophisticated than this, a cognitive process that's more sophisticated called fluid intelligence. And fluid intelligence is our capacity to think logically and solve problems in novel situations independent of acquired knowledge. So it's our ability really to think on our feet rather than our ability to retain and recall facts. And fluid intelligence involves analyzing the novel situation, identifying patterns and relationships that underpin the situation, and then extrapolating from these using our logical abilities. The study found that fluid intelligence declined more slowly in meditators than in age-matched controls. And this is particularly crucial in today's world where facts are easy to look up. You can Google anything. But interpreting them, figuring out what they mean, that's the challenge that we face. And it's nice to know that meditating can help to keep this faculty intact as we get older. Now, different types of meditation seem to yield different results in terms of electroencephalogram patterns, brainwave patterns. In fact, Buddhist lamas were asked to change from one type of meditation practice to another, and they wound up changing their brainwave patterns. Let me tell you a little bit about brainwave patterns. They've been classified in bands based on frequency of brainwaves. The fastest waves are called beta, and those occur when we're consciously alert, perhaps agitated, tense, and afraid, maybe too consciously alert in a sense. And those operate between 13 and 60 cycles per second, also called hertz. A little bit slower are alpha waves, and those happen when we're entering states of physical and mental relaxation, but are still quite awake and aware of our environment. And those are at 7 to 13 hertz. Slower still, we get into theta waves. And those are when we're beginning to really slow down and we're beginning to move towards sleep and levels of reduced consciousness. And those happen between 4 and 7 hertz, and then there are the delta waves. And that's when we're headed into deep sleep, and those are at 0.1 to 4 hertz. So deep relaxation, which occasionally happens during mindfulness practice, tends to be associated with high theta and delta waves, not surprisingly. What's interesting is that concentration and open monitoring, the two of the three skills we've been talking about developing, they seem to be associated with high alpha and high beta waves. So that suggests that these states generally are highly wakeful states. And it's interesting because many people tend to think, oh, meditation practice, that's all about calming down. Well, yes and no. It's about being calm, but it's also about being very alert. And among Tibetan monks, metta or loving kindness practices produce different patterns than other practices. Now, to my mind, one of the most fascinating studies that's been done about brainwave activity and meditation, mindfulness meditation, was done by Richard Davidson at the Laboratory for Effective Neuroscience at the University of Wisconsin. I'd mentioned this study briefly earlier. Over years, he and his colleagues learned that when we're distressed, our brain activity tends to center on both the amygdala, that's the almond-shaped part of the brain that detects danger, and on the right prefrontal cortex, this region behind the forehead. And this region is particularly important for hypervigilance. And activity in one or the other areas tends to predict our daily moods. So they did these high-resolution EEG studies, again, hundreds of electrodes around the skull. And they found that in general, studying a broad population of people, there's a bell-shaped curve. And those folks who have more right prefrontal activation tended to be predisposed to clinical depression or anxiety, and those with more left prefrontal activation reported that their moods were rare or transient. There's obviously a lot of survival value to right prefrontal activation because it's about hypervigilance. It's about being aware of the environment and scanning for danger. For psychological well-being, however, it's not so great. But historically, equanimity and feelings of peace didn't confer a big survival advantage. So summarizing the differences between left prefrontal and right prefrontal cortical activity, when there's a lot of left prefrontal activity, people tend to report being happy, enthusiastic, and energized, kind of the opposite of depressed and anxious. And when there's right prefrontal activity, they're hypervigilant, depressed, or anxious. And this was studied initially in so-called normal individuals, also known as college sophomores, but it's since been replicated in older folks as well. Now, what Richard Davidson found was after having tested 175 people in the lab and gotten that bell-shaped curve, he brought in a Tibetan Lama. And that Tibetan Lama had the most extreme value to the left in terms of left versus right prefrontal activation of anybody that had been measured to that point. Then they brought in other Tibetan monks over time, and they were all similarly very left-sided. But Richie is a very good researcher, and he raised this question. He said, well, maybe it's people who have a lot of left prefrontal cortical activity are the ones who become monks in Tibet. Maybe we're simply measuring a pre-existing disposition. So he got together with John Kabat-Zinn, and they took a group of stressed-out biotech workers and randomly assigned half of them to an 8-week mindfulness training course and half of them to just be on the wait list. And before the course, everybody tipped right because, indeed, they were stressed out biotech workers. After the course, the group that had gone through the course tipped left, but the others didn't. And the ones who had gone through the training had improved moods, they felt more engaged and more anxious. They also gave flu vaccines to both groups, and the immune response to the flu vaccine was much stronger in the folks who had been doing the meditation practice. So it appeared to help boost the functioning of our immune system. Now, another area of interest are regions of the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. And this is associated with attention and executive decision making. And it's activated by a wide variety of practices. This is one of the few areas that have been examined in many different kinds of meditation. It turns out it's activated by Kundalini yoga, by mindfulness meditation, but also by Tibetan Buddhist imagery practices, by Zen practices, and even Psalms recitation. So researchers are just beginning to investigate how these different forms of meditation might affect the brain differently. But it's clear at this point that all of these different practices have measurable effects on our neurobiology. Now, other studies are showing that even within one type of meditation, different doses seem to have different effects. One study involved the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC, and this revealed a particularly complicated, nonlinear response to meditation. Now, the ACC is involved in the integration of attention, motivation, and motor control. And this is what the researchers found. Non-meditators, complete beginners, show more activity in the ACC than Buddhist monks. Okay, that suggests that meditation practice calms down the ACC. But they found that more regular non-monastic meditators, lay people who have been at this, show even more activity in the ACC than the non-meditators. So why does a lot of meditation on the part of monks yield very low ACC activity? Trying meditation for the first time yields a bit more, but moderate experience shows the most ACC activity? Well, one hypothesis is that for the monks, attention and motor control has become effortless. They've become so good at it that they don't need a lot of activation of this part of the brain. While regular meditators know how to activate these circuits, but they have to still exert a lot of efforts to do it. And perhaps the novices show less activity because they don't really know at all how to activate these attention and control circuits. Clearly, we're just at the beginning of understanding how these things might work. Now, the insula is a part of the brain that's associated with interoception or proprioceptive awareness, visceral or gut feelings, and it processes transient body sensations. We found that it's activated during mindfulness meditation. I mentioned earlier that it's important for empathy. It deals in particular with our visceral responses to the feelings of others and simulating inside what we're imagining is happening in another person, probably through the action of mirror neurons. And the fact that it's activated in mindfulness meditation suggests that mindfulness meditation should indeed help us to respond more empathically to others. Now, there's been a recent study of patients with generalized anxiety disorder, and this study stands out because it used a really good control group and it looks at the interface between neurobiology and a clinical disorder. Now, generalized anxiety disorder means pretty much being afraid of everything. It's not like a specific phobia where you're afraid of snakes or dogs, perhaps, nor the kind of thing like difficulty with public speaking or going on airplanes. It's when we tend to feel fearful across the board. Now, I've mentioned the amygdala. That's the almond-shaped part of the brain that's responsible for determining if stimuli are dangerous or not. Is it a lion or is it a beige rock? Well, folks without anxiety problems and anxiety patients were both shown pictures of angry, neutral, and happy faces while in a functional MRI machine. And the anxiety patients showed higher amygdala activation than the people without anxiety in response to neutral but not angry faces. And that suggests that ambiguous stimuli, a neutral face where you can't quite tell what they're feeling, elicits a stronger fear reaction in these generalized anxiety disordered folks than it does in normal people. And the anxiety patients were then randomized to either an 8-week mindfulness training or a stress reduction program. And the nice thing about this study was the stress reduction program was identical in structure, same amount of time in various activities. It was just instead of doing mindfulness training, they were training in other things. The amygdala reaction to neutral faces decreased more in the mindfulness meditation group than in the stress reduction group. Now, the prefrontal cortex is part of the brain that evaluates emotional responses and regulates emotions. It thinks, yes, it does look like a lion, but lions aren't generally found around here, so it's probably a beige rock. And the research has found that the activation of the prefrontal cortex, as well as the connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, suggesting the prefrontal cortex is regulating the effects of the amygdala, increased significantly more from before the intervention to afterwards in the mindfulness group, but not in the stress management group. Also, scores on measures of anxiety were lower in the mindfulness group. So here we see that mindfulness meditation activates parts of the brain that are essential for keeping our emotions in perspective and has the clinical effect of reducing excessive anxiety. So now let's talk about brain structure. This is where the experience of my London cabbie comes in, because this is about experience-dependent neuroplasticity. I mentioned before that when I was in training many years ago, we used to believe that the brain reaches peak development at age 25 and deteriorates thereafter. Actually, the brain is much more like a muscle. If you use it, it bulks up. If you don't, it tends to wither. And a lot of data beyond London taxi drivers' experiences has been accumulating. For example, people who learn to juggle and are scanned in an MRI, and 3 months later are scanned again, show changes in areas that detect visual motion. Also, we see this in musicians. Professional musicians have more neuronal cell bodies, or gray matter, than amateurs in areas of the brain related to musical ability. And amateurs have more gray matter than people with no musical training. This is all evidence of brain plasticity. What we do with our attention really matters. So remember why hair thinning isn't such a big deal? It's because aging and pathology are usually associated with cortical thinning, with losing gray matter in the cortex. And there was this landmark study in 2005 by my friend and colleague Sarah Lazar at Mass General Hospital. She took 20 long-term Western meditators and age-matched controls. They had on average 9 years of meditation experience. I was actually a subject in this. I wanted to give you an idea of what it felt like to participate. I was slid headfirst lying down into a big MRI machine, and then a mirror was suspended above my eyes so I could see out through the opening where my feet extended into the outside world, and I could see written instructions. Then they turned on the machine, and it started very loud, rhythmic clunking, and I was asked to do breath awareness practice. It was a bit challenging at first to meditate given the loud rhythmic clanking, but after a while it became just another stimulus and I was able to develop some concentration. But one of the challenges they have in doing this kind of research is how to get experienced meditators not to practice meditation. Because when you've been doing this for years, if you lie down somewhere, the natural tendency is to start following the breath. So they had us try doing 2 different non-meditative activities. They had us lying there and, quote, doing nothing, and then they had us generating random numbers. And generating random numbers genuinely felt like a different state of consciousness than following my breath or trying to do nothing. Trying to do nothing was actually the hardest. So what did Sarah and her team discover? Well, they discovered that compared to age-matched controls, the meditators had thicker anterior insula, sensory cortex, and prefrontal cortex. And the differences in thickness were most pronounced in the older subjects. If you saw graphs of these, you'd see in the meditators going from age 20 up to age 50, things were pretty even, but in the non-meditators, you saw them decline. You saw thinning happening in these various areas. Now, the 3 regions affected by meditation practices were all thought to be involved in integrating emotional and cognitive processes. The opposite development, decreased volume in at least one of the affected structures, the anterior insula, has been strongly implicated in several pathologies, including post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, social anxiety, specific phobias, and schizophrenia even. So we start to see that what's being maintained here, when it shrinks, is often associated with real difficulties. Now, there are some limitations to this study. It had relatively small numbers, people were only imaged once, and maybe people who have naturally thicker cortexes are more likely to practice meditation. Nonetheless, the findings did fit expectations. The areas associated with paying attention to the breath and sensory stimuli, and areas associated with the integration of thoughts and feelings had increases in thickness proportional to the amount of time people spent meditating in their lifetime. To get beyond these limitations, we need to do pre-post studies. We need to be able to randomly assign people to meditation or non. And there has been one 8-week mindfulness course. It was given to people with no meditation training, while a similar group was in a control group. And the researchers found increases in gray matter concentration within the left hippocampus and other areas. Now, the hippocampus is involved not only in learning and memory, but also in emotion regulation. And in fact, it gets smaller in depression and anxiety, and stress seems to shrink it. So altogether, the researchers concluded that participating in 8 weeks of mindfulness training was associated with changes in gray matter concentration in brain regions involved in learning and memory processes, emotion regulation, self-referential processing, and perspective taking, all valuable things to experience. So we're seeing that pre-post studies are showing that changes aren't just due to meditators being vegetarians or something else peculiar. Even when subjects are randomly assigned to mindfulness meditation or control groups, mindfulness training produces measurable changes in important brain regions. In our next lecture, we're going to look at how mindfulness practices can help with a common problem in modern life: feeling lonely, isolated, or alienated from others. Thanks for listening.